Here at Hardware Sugar, we get our fair share of big builds. So those are the big boys. This is also kind of big. Ito medyo medium. Pero yung usong-uso talaga ngayon yung ITX builds, which are basically the smallest form factor you can get for consumer level. And you might have been thinking na, oo nga, gusto ko ng ITX. Pero narinig mo rin na maraming problema. Mahal, mainit, mahirap gawin. In this video, we're gonna talk about 10 ITX PC building myths. We're gonna say, oh nga, yan, totoo yan. Ito, hindi. And at the end of the video, baka you'll decide na you want an ITX build, and now is the best time to get one.
Sawa ka na ba sa unactivated Windows mo? Well, lucky you! Pinakabago mula sa cdkeyoffer.com. Windows 10 and Windows 11 activation codes. Legit, safe, at pinakamura. Madali lang umorder. Hanapin ang Windows version na gusto mo. Piliin ang preferred payment method. Wala pang 5 minutes, nagsisigi ka na para sa Windows mo. Marami na kaming natulungan.
Dati, sad and depressed ako. But now, I found the love of my life.
Dati, aimless and walang purpose ang life ko. But now, I'm a world-class Zumba instructor.
So, web developer ako and content creator for a YouTube channel. And ngayon, ganun pa rin ako pero activated na yung Windows ko.
Kaya kung naghahanap ka ng legit, mura, at original software,
Check out cdkeyoffer.com.
Check out cdkeyoffer.com.
Check out cdkeyoffer.com.
First, kuno ITX builds are expensive, and that is false. While ITX components, yes, are generally more expensive compared to similar performance, but bigger form factor counterparts, we're starting to see a lot of brands offering quality ITX components which don't break the bank. Example nito would be the Deepcool CH160, ITX case, one of our most popular options, which is only around 2,800 for the black version. And of course, these options will not be as fancy as the high-end ones. They usually have limited expansion slots and I/O. But if budget is tight and you want a small form factor PC, it's not impossible. In fact, baka habol mo lang talaga sa ITX yung small size because it will be for a home office or some other place you want to discreetly tuck a PC in. In that case, you don't need to worry about what GPU to fit, what high-capacity PSU to get, or what cooler you need. You'll be able to build an SFF, ITX PC without any headaches. Even for gaming rigs, we've had ITX builds ranging from 40 to 50K, and even then, you can still shave off a little bit here and there from that kind of build. 2 ITX PCs are harder to build. Yun, totoo. Not gonna lie, mas mahirap talaga mag-build ng ITX. Possibly the hardest part is the initial research. The biggest hurdle with the ITX PCs is yung clearances and compatibility. In order to even get started planning an ITX build, you have to double, triple check the dimensions and specs of all your components. Something you don't necessarily need to worry about for bigger builds. Looking at official specs doesn't even get you halfway there because sometimes, most of the time, the dimensions listed by the brands themselves aren't the most accurate. Kaya to be sure, you want to go to ITX communities like those on Reddit, PC building groups, Facebook, where people tell first-hand experience. With ITX builds, it's not uncommon to end up with parts that just won't fit, even if the specs say that they will. And that frustration is almost given for this form factor. That's also the reason why it's more DIY. And even when you have parts that fit, the build process is a bit more involved as you're dealing with very tight clearances. You often have to think creatively on how to finesse parts into their slot, what angle to put it in. Your cable management also has to be on point as you don't want room for loose or dangling cables. There are cases like the NR200P or CH160 with more room than usual ITX cases, but even there you can't get away with unkept cables. Most importantly, you'll need a lot of patience, especially if it's your first time. ITX builds more often than not have different layouts, where the components are not in their usual places, so there is a bit of a learning curve. 3 ITX PC components are limited, mahirap hanapin. False. When it comes to ITX builds, the most important are an ITX motherboard, low-profile cooler, and an SFX PSU. But nowadays, we're starting to see a lot of innovations in case designs that give more freedom, more leeway para sa iba't-ibang configurations. Technically, it's true that there are fewer ITX-specific models for components, The available ones are more than enough to cover a lot of use cases. And with the release of easier ITX cases like the NR200P, CH160, and the Fractal Design Torrent Nano, we're seeing a lot of brands focusing on SFF more than ever. For example, big brands like Gigabyte, Asus, MSI, all of those guys have their own specific line of SFF-ready GPUs. In addition, ITX cases are starting to incorporate more, meaning bigger cooling options. So normal coolers like the Arctic Freezer 36 can fit in a lot of SFF cases. And there are also cases that provide more options for AIOs. For example, the DAN A4H20 is a popular pick, as well as the NR200P Max, which already comes with its own AIO. With the CH160, you don't necessarily need an SFX PSU as it can fit a normal ATX one with enough clearance for the GPU, but this comes at the expense of drive and fan mounts. So unless you're really going for niche, enthusiast level cases, you have a lot of options for parts. 4 ITX builds are less powerful, false. Yun nga, nabanggit natin in the previous myth that there are a lot of options already for ITX builds. Anything you can have in larger MATX or ATX builds, you can also have in an ITX build. Dito sa Hardware Sugar, we've had a couple of ITX builds na yung CPU 9950X3D and GPU 5090. So that's basically that's like the top tier combination that you can have on the market right now, napasok sa ITX. The most noticeable trade-off with any ITX build is the fewer expansion slots. Things like having only a maximum of 2 DIMM slots for the RAM, having fewer slots for NVMe, generally having fewer I/O ports. But with that said, there are a few configurations and adjustments you can make to the build to cover those, like getting larger capacity RAM or SSD, and making use of high bandwidth USB-C hubs. May workarounds naman. There are limitations, but in terms of raw performance, ITX can be just as fast as anything out there. 5 ITX PCs run hot. That's true. Generally, the more high-end the component, the more heat it can generate. And there's less room, less volume inside an ITX case for heat to dissipate into. It's just the physics of it. It can get hot real fast, unlike in larger cases where, as you can see, there's more room for the heat to vent out into, so heat doesn't build up as fast. Although, ITX cases nowadays do allow for bigger coolers, and these coolers can cool even high-end CPUs. At the size constraints, it is called small form factor for a reason. That also means less room for case fan mounts. With that said, we describe today's ITX cooling as usually sufficient. Yes, they do run hotter, but not to the point of thermal throttling or failure. In other words, your performance will not be affected even if the heat is a bit higher. And we have mentioned the DIY aspect previously. ITX enthusiasts usually do undervolting to further manage temperatures for high-end CPUs. 6 ITX PCs are harder to clean, maintain. That's true. Unlike the bigger form factors, cleaning an ITX PC usually means taking most of the components apart just to be able to do regular dusting. Sikip kasi. That's just the nature of these PCs where components are sandwiched together. While you don't have to redo the cabling, you'd often need to remove the GPU and sometimes even the cooler to reach inside to get to the other components. It's not an understatement to say that you'll be rebuilding an ITX PC in its lifetime way more than regular-sized PCs. And that's just for cleaning. Troubleshooting, ganun din. Troubleshooting usually requires testing out other components, so swapping them out to isolate the ones with issues. And that's just not easy to do with an ITX build. Troubleshooting is all about access. I need access to a PSU to check it out, I need access to the SSD to check it, etc. And access is just simply harder in an ITX build kasi ang sikip niya. Even Disney knows this.
Phenomenal cosmic powers! Come on, you're the genie! I love freedom! Itty bitty living space.
7 ITX PCs are hard to upgrade. That's true. If you're ever going to be replacing a component in an ITX build, you need to repeat the intense research you did when you first built it. And that means taking into account, again, all the dimensions and specs of the components, not just the case. You'll usually have to remove other components before you can reach the one that you're upgrading. And so it's very different compared to upgrading an ATX build where you only have to worry about the case clearance itself. And as we've emphasized dito sa ITX, space is a premium, hirap makapasok, there are headaches involved. 8. ITX PCs are hard to customize aesthetically. False. While earlier ITX builds were usually a one-and-done affair, you just build it and that's it, we're seeing more and more ITX options that feature tempered glass panels and even RGB. Cases like the CH160 and the Jonesbow T6, T8, and TK0 all feature tempered glass panels where you can see the inside of the case. And also, they now come in different unusual colors like the Fractal Design Terra, which comes in jade. You don't usually see that in a lot of other cases, let alone ITX cases. And the popularity of LED screens, we're seeing that now in single fans like the Lian Li Unifan TL series. Builders use these as the centerpiece in cases like the TK0. So those are just some examples of how you can mix and match components that are meant for ATX or they can be in any build, even in ITX builds. Kasi may mga cases naman that support them. 9. ITX PCs are portable. That is true. But yes, the main allure for the ITX PC is the size. You save space for a cleaner desktop, and that also means that they're very easy to transport. However, as with anything that has sensitive circuitry, we don't really recommend transporting it willy-nilly. There's also a risk that cables will come loose during transit. Even components like GPUs, they can be shaken enough that they can cause damage to the other parts of the computer. Because they're small, you might be tempted to transport them, and you can, but take care. Getting a specialized bag or carry case is recommended if you're going to be moving around your PC. Either that or lots and lots of bubble wrap. 10. ITX PCs are only for enthusiasts. False. You might get the idea that ITX builds are only for hardcore PC experts, and that's just not true. We, of course, don't recommend it if you're just starting out in the hobby, if you've never built a computer before. But as with any hobby, the fun is taking on a challenge. Yes, the end product is nice, but there's also, masaya just learning as you go along. Discovering new things and applying what you learned in something that's going to be super cool. Like a gaming PC that's barely bigger than an AVR. Yes, there are risks. You can end up with parts that just don't fit. And sometimes it's an expensive mistake. But in some sick, twisted way, that is what ITX enthusiasts understand. The pain is part of the pleasure. Because on the other side of that, when everything works out, the rig looks very nice. Every nook and cranny, you know talaga. You had to do the cable management, you had to figure out why, how to get this in. You know the story of why that cable bundle had to be looped like that. The 2 hours you spent trying to find the exact angle to work that gigantic 5090 in. The 0.05mm gap between the cooler and the case panel that you most certainly accounted for. Sarap ng feeling. The lows are low, but the highs are very high. And so, I'm not an ITX expert. To be honest, I've never done an ITX build. I always prefer my builds large, so they're easier to do. But here are some of our regular ITX addicts. They're the experts, and this is what they have to say. Final word on ITX.